Hello, welcome to everybody, particularly to those who are attending today's meeting for the first time. The Climate Advocacy Group, which is one of 3 dynamic interest groups, part of CALL, have prepared this presentation for today. The group meets on the 3rd Wednesday of each month. We all learn from one another in particular. We connect with other interest groups in Ontario. We join with them in advocating for policies to protect the planet. We do research, and we've written many letters to MPs, MPPs, op-eds, and made deputations to City Hall, prepared submissions to the federal parliament, and signed petitions with other groups. We all come with different political perspectives, but we plan to use our voice to best look at it, and we look at issues in a balanced way and nonpartisan way. And we hope that what you'll get from this is that you will be able to use your voice. Let's talk just a little bit about the goals for today. So we hope that what we're going to leave you with is some information on some of the key climate issues, which will help you evaluate all of the parties' platforms on climate issues. We hope that you'll have a better grasp of some of the current government's record. And most importantly, we hope that you'll get involved after you hear this. So what would an election be without some discussion of polls? And I'm going to turn it over to Liz Addison to speak to what she has gleaned from the early provincial polling on voter intentions and priorities.
So we are a nonpartisan organization, but I think most people who are concerned about climate change tend to be somewhat critical or extremely critical of the present Ford government. So for those people, I have some sobering news for most of us, which is that the Ford government is poised to win another majority government on June the 2nd. The PCs are gaining with every poll as the election date approaches. So first, let's look at the data from, next slide, sorry. Yeah. Let's look at the data from 338 Canada's statistical poll. This is a fantastic website that you can go to find out what the projections are in your riding as well. And so when I first looked at this poll a month and a half ago, the PCs had a 92% chance of winning the election on June the 2nd, but they had only, if you look at the bars on the right, the graph on the right, they had only a 50-50 chance of forming a majority government. Now, let's see how things are evolving. This is from March 27th, so only like a week and a half ago. And you can see that the PCs now have a 96% chance of winning the most seats and forming the government, but they now have a 61% chance of getting a majority of the seats. Next slide. And here is the most recent for April the 2nd, so only 4 days ago, sorry. And it shows a near 100% probability that the PCs will win the election and nearly an 80%, so 79% chance of winning a majority government. So next slide shows, so the polling on March the 27th shows the PCs about 8 percentage points ahead of the Liberals and 11 points ahead of the NDP. The chart on the right projected that the Conservatives would win 68 seats, which is 5 more than the 63 seats they need to form a majority. So keep that in mind. It's 63 to form a majority. More recent data from April 2nd shows the PCs with an 11% lead over the Liberals and a 13% lead over the NDP. and it projects the PCs with 74 seats in the legislature. The odds of a PC majority win are even greater, according to a recently released poll by Leger for Post Media. It shows, hold on. Yeah, it shows the PCs 14 points ahead of the Liberals and 15 points ahead of the NDP. Next slides. So the next 3 slides offer the only glimmer of hope, depending on your politics, that the situation might change over the next 2 months. This slide shows that 53% of voters may change their minds, plus another 4% who say they didn't know if their minds were made up, so they just weren't sure. The next slide shows that many voters remain unfamiliar with the leaders of 2 of the opposition parties, including 33% who feel that they don't know enough about Stephen Del Duca to form an opinion of him, and a staggering 48% who feel the same way about Mike Schreiner of the Green Party. And the next slide, also from Leger, shows that climate change ranks 8th in the list of issues that are most important to Ontario voters. Only 8% ranked this issue as their number 1 concern, and only 29% placed it in their top 5 issues. And you can see that, that the top of mind for most people is inflation and the cost of living and housing and economic recovery and exactly what you would guess given the situation right now. And so my conclusion is that the only way groups like ours can change the trajectory of this election is to do 4 things. And I'll just say that I really do believe that the Conservatives will win the election, but, it would be good, in my opinion, if they could win only a minority government, which would give them somewhat less control. So, number 1 is to make climate change a more important issue for voters. So bring it up from number 8 to number, something higher. Make it clear that the Ford government is not a friend of the environment. Advocate for opposition parties and their more climate-supportive policies. And the last one is consider measures to avoid vote splitting between more progressive parties.
So I just wanted to introduce what the Climate Advocacy Group has done. So we're kind of facing a really serious challenge. The IPCC's Working Group 3, which looks at how to mitigate climate change that's going on, reported on Monday, and their major headline is that we are not on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. Some action is occurring, but we need immediate and deep emissions across all sectors. And we should be looking to peak climate emissions in the next 3 years, basically. I think it says 4 years here, but in fact, they said 3 years. We've got it at 3 years. We've got to start coming down in real emissions by 2025. So this is a huge challenge to all governments, including the provincial government. And we prepared this report thinking about the Ontario election that's come up. So we looked at, the Ford government has blocked action on climate change, both on mitigation and adaptation. And so we started looking at where do we really need to take critical action in the coming 3 or 4 years of basically the life of the next government. And we looked in particular at 3 areas where emissions are highest in the province. So transportation, industry, and buildings are responsible for about 80% of emissions in the province. So we looked at what the challenges are in those areas and what needs to be done in order to make a difference, to really start bringing down those emissions. We also took a look at the electricity system because it's essential to making those changes in transportation industry and buildings to bring down emissions. And then finally, we looked at adaptation, which is really essential because we're seeing those impacts already, as in BC this year, and to a lesser extent in Northern Ontario with wildfires and so on. We need to be working on adaptation.
So this was transportation is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in Ontario. It's about 35% of all greenhouse gas emissions are from various forms of transportation. And that figure does not include air travel. And considering our sort of provincial landscape where goods and services and people are transported long distances, this is obviously a critical area for us to pay attention to. So the emissions that we take into account to get to that 35% are personal transportation, the mass transit systems, the local transit systems, interprovincial delivery of goods, all industrial and commercial transportation within our borders in Ontario. So it's not terribly surprising that it's the largest greenhouse gas emissions in the province. So clearly what this means is that we need a rapid transition away from fossil fuels powering any of our transportation systems. And the one thing that's very clear about the current government policy is that, at which they produced two reports on this. This Driving Prosperity is the name of the reports. They de-emphasize the whole area of public transit and commercial transportation. These are not big issues for them. In fact, their whole policy surrounds the idea of expanding the capacity for manufacturing in Ontario of electric vehicles and pushing hydrogen production and autonomous vehicle technology, which all sounds like it's a good industrial strategy, but it is missing completely on the areas where a huge number of greenhouse gas emissions exist, and that is in the areas of transit and other forms of transportation. And they also are looking at ways in which to increase the production of parts for automobiles. So in other words, it's a manufacturing strategy. They also are looking at the technology sector because Ontario has some technology hubs in order to push the development of batteries for vehicles and the technology around autonomous vehicles, driverless vehicles. So that's part of their strategy. So you can sort of see on this slide, there are two areas they concentrate on in their policy. Supply side, which is sort of the business side, where there's incentives for business to set up shop in Ontario, and they've been somewhat successful in that, as EVs before their mandate were not going to be built in Ontario, and now there are 3 plants where EVs are going to be built, and they're pouring money into supporting automobile manufacturing companies in order to set up here. And so they're reducing red tape. They want to figure out how to enable the investment and subsidize the investment if necessary. They're going to reduce business costs and taxes in order to make that happen. They're moving forward on all of those issues. On the demand side, which is the sort of consumer side, they have abandoned all of the previous incentive programs. They canceled the EV purchase incentives. The only thing really on the consumer side is HOV lanes and green license plates, so you can travel with one person in your car on an HOV lane. Fines for parking in EV spots and tax write-offs for businesses that install charging stations, but those, of course, are more almost on the, it's sort of a 50-50 split on whether it's a demand side or a supply side. So that's essentially the issues that the government is dealing with. And I'll just mention quickly that the whole concept of moving to EVs is complex, and it's not simple. Moving to electric vehicles in all forms is probably what we need to do, because we have to stop the use of fossil fuels. However, there are issues around the rare earth minerals that need to be produced for batteries. There's a strategy to expand to create the ring of fire where a lot of these minerals exist, which will have impacts on indigenous lands and wetlands, and a huge impact on the environment in order to mine those materials. But that's their intent and their strategy. And the emphasis on personal vehicles by having them manufactured is a growth strategy for Ontario, when in fact some of us believe that the forever growth model is exactly what's got us into this situation, and that we have to have degrowth strategies or no growth strategies in order to be able to move forward. So the whole idea of just manufacturing more individual cars so individuals can be on the road ignores the need for transit and other mobility solutions. So let's talk about solutions. Rapid transit, this an old TTC symbol here, but let's look at these solutions. We think that the priority and the questions for people running for office should be around mobility priorities. If you were in office, what would be your priorities around other ways in which to move us around that do not involve everybody being forced, in fact, to buy a electric vehicle? And so clearly investing in mass transit is and the GO system and highway public transit only lanes, for instance, on highways and so on. Those are some of the solutions we think should be there. A no-fare local transit system funded similar to Medicare or CPP, and a sort of ability to pay model would make a huge difference in terms of people moving from individual transportation to public transit. There needs to be a huge emphasis on interurban solutions and intra-urban solutions to local delivery vehicles. We know because of the COVID and people shopping online that there are just thousands of vehicles on the road every day delivering packages. And that needs to change, and we suggest it needs to change by 2027. And then this idea of last mile transit is when you get, for instance, on a Via Rail train and go somewhere, what happens when you get off that train? And the last mile sort of to get you to either link to a robust transit system or somehow linked to where you're actually headed needs to be created, and that does not exist in Ontario. And then the support for active mobility solutions like cycling, walking, the whole changing the Planning Act so that we create 15-minute cities where everything that you really need you can walk to in 15 minutes. Some of us who live in some of the downtown neighborhoods might feel that we have that 15-minute city feeling, but if you go to Brampton, you need a car. E-bikes, scooters, and car sharing, and the development of a car sharing app. Those are things that we think are high priorities. So if you were looking at the sort of big picture policy suggestions, we need to end sprawl. No new highways. That Highway 413 and the Bradford bypass are a disaster for both the environment and for the expansion of their strategy. Their strategy is to get more cars on the road. So that's just the wrong direction, and we need massive increase in transit infrastructure, including the things that I just talked about. In order to do that, of course, we need electrical grid improvements, and that's something that Karen will talk about in a little while, electrification of the urban freight that I talked about, and there needs to be research and development to recycle internal combustion engines so that we can take these cars off the road and recycle and reuse every bit of that car, which now, as you know, they generally pile up in scrapyards. But those materials could be recycled, and there is a strategy in place by DeFasco in Hamilton to actually do that.
Michael Berger has a question. Conversion of local delivery, what does that mean?
So the conversion of local delivery is from any fossil fuel powered delivery truck to EV or green hydrogen. Mostly an EV strategy is rolling out in Ontario, and I think this government certainly would be proposing battery technology over hydrogen. And producing green hydrogen is a real challenge. If you use gas and oil to produce the hydrogen, you're really not improving anything. So the idea is to take all of the gas-powered or diesel-powered trucks off the road and replace them with EVs.
And Elaine Graham asked, please explain more about last mile connection.
Right. So if you I'm just use a hypothetical example. If you take a train to Barrie, before the train actually left you off in downtown Barrie, it left you in Innisfil. And so how do you get from Innisfil to the train to downtown Barrie? And there was a very clunky methodology for getting from Innisfil to downtown Barrie. So last mile would be that there's a very robust system where whenever a train stops in a community, and this could be a GO train or a VIA train, that there is a EV bus or some kind of transportation system to get you to where the major hub is for local transport. So you're going from mass transport from city to city to a interim step to get you to the local transit system. That's what last mile means.
Thank you for that, Michael. One of the concerns that I have is that the solutions that we're talking about, while of course they make sense, my concern is that, like, in terms of changing or adding to mass transit and the very local cities, is that do we have time? Like, I'm really concerned about that. I mean, I think of the Eglinton line that took years and years and years to develop, and it's going to be probably another 2 years. Like, it hasn't been functional for 7 years. How are we going to scale up fast enough in rapid transit and some of these solutions when we, quote, don't have time?
We could use China as an example. They can build a rapid transit system in 12 months. It's a question of commitment and willingness to do it. If you commit the money and the resources and decide that has to be your strategy in order to stop fossil fuel, the expansion of the use of fossil fuels, it could be done. But there is no willingness on the part of government to do anything fast. We could do it faster, but there just isn't that willingness to do it. Other jurisdictions can build subways for 10, 15 kilometers within a year. It doesn't take 7 years to build these things.
When China decides they want to build a subway, they just mow down neighborhoods. And so it's very autocratic. They get it done, but at what expense?
I'd be barefoot if I didn't say that the federal Liberals also have lagged their feet on climate, not just the provincial Tories. I mean, so for some of us who are either red Tories or blue Liberals, everybody's got their hand on this pile of manure in terms of how poorly they have acted. The second, Michael, that I would throw out is, if you just do the math and figure out if you had to charge an electric vehicle and just 50% were electric vehicles and you're driving and it takes you 5 minutes to fill up your car, and there are at least 6 pumps, and until you have about 25 charging stations at every, you're going to be spending an hour and a half in line to charge your vehicle. So until we can figure out the range issue, I think that's a red herring in terms of electric vehicles. But I think your point about electrification of mass transit is absolutely the place to go. You can also build a steel mill. I have a friend in the steel mill business. You can build a steel mill in 9 months in China, and it takes you 7 years here. mainly because they don't care about the environment. If there's a city, they move the entire city. And if you look at how they did with their building their last subway, they basically moved everybody out of their apartments and just rammed it through. So our challenge is, if you take the crosstown link, we couldn't even work at night because it disturbed people. So until we can figure that, or we put subways where no one lives, I think that's going to be problematic. So I believe your point, and I really like us to concentrate more on the electrification of mass transit, so that we have faster, cleaner transit that allows us to run more and not hurt the environment, because as we know, buses and trucks do a lot of the damage. So I just wanted to point that out, but I do congratulate you on bringing this up. Appreciate it.
So I'm looking at the industrial sector, which is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases in Ontario, and it is responsible for 28% of emissions. The major sources are the heavy industries, iron and steel, cement, chemicals, refining of oil and metals. This slide shows the harm already caused by the PC government in this sector. Upon winning election in 2018, the current government repealed the cap and trade program put in place by the previous Liberal government. They then canceled contracts for green energy projects funded through the revenues generated by the cap and trade, at a cost to the province of some $3 billion. Other decisions made by the present government continue to harm the environment, including some that impact pollution from Ontario's industries. So they slashed the budget of the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks by about a third, resulting in cuts to staff responsible for inspections and enforcement. They reduced the environmental accountability of the government by abolishing the Office of the Environmental Commissioner and transferring its duties to the Auditor General and the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks, with fewer staff resources than the Commissioner's office had. And the Ford government has come under repeated fire from Ontario's Auditor General for not following the province's Environmental Bill of Rights. In November 2021, the Auditor General accused the government of deliberately undermining its own rules. Based on our research, the top climate advocacy priorities for the industrial sector call for the government to enforce the polluter pays principle, which requires that government charge the real cost of environmental damage and cleanup to the companies that cause it, and expand the personal liability of officers and directors for climate and environmental pollution created by their companies on their watch. Increase energy efficiency of production processes and heat systems. Encourage carbon capture from industrial emitters, and promote electrification of industrial processes. We also endorse the following planks for the industrial sector from the Ontario Green Party's election platform, which call for the government to use incentives and government procurement to support Ontario entrepreneurs to build clean businesses and careers, especially in energy storage, electric and fuel cell mobility, smart transit, and low-carbon biomaterials. Build on Ontario's strengths in mining, innovation, financing, and auto manufacturing to create a strong electric transportation industry supply chain. Demand that the federal government establish border carbon adjustments to establish a level playing field for Ontario's low-carbon producers. Set strict standards for polluting industries and help them meet these standards through low-interest loans, Ontario Centres of Excellence, collaboration with clean tech solution providers, and public procurement, and help small and medium-sized businesses transition to the green economy through financial incentives and grants.
I'm going to address the building sector. The building sector is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. More worrisome is that the emissions in this sector have been growing, and they've grown 12% between 1990 and 2018. I'd like to draw your attention too to the fact that it's actually gotten really hard to get data about emissions that's recent. So a lot of the emissions information that we've been citing comes from sort of 2018 and 2019, because the Ford government really hasn't been doing much of a job of keeping track or of reporting those emissions. So in the building sector, most of those emissions come from the use of fossil fuels to heat water and space heating. And when we're talking about those buildings, we're talking about not just residential buildings, which we think about a lot as individuals, multi-unit apartments and condos and single-family homes, but we're talking about institutional buildings, government buildings, schools, universities, hospitals, and so on, and commercial buildings, malls, individual stores, warehouses, and so on. So the strategies for each of those sectors is going to be a little bit different, but we need to keep all of them in mind when we're thinking about reducing emissions. So what happened when the current government came into power? There actually were a number of programs that were in place previous to their arrival that were looking at increasing the energy efficiency of buildings, either through retrofits or through changes in the energy source. So there were 41 sustainable social housing programs, for example, that were in the planning stages and early implementation stage that they simply canceled. There were 20 retrofit projects for major social housing apartment buildings. Again, looking to improve insulation, looking to make the HVAC systems in those buildings and so on more energy efficient and so on, canceled. There was a whole program for Green Ontario home efficiency rebates for individual homes, which encouraged individual homeowners to install energy efficient furnaces, air source heat pumps, insulation upgrades, and do all of that kind of thing, canceled. So, and now, to add insult to injury, the government is now planning to expand the use of natural gas to rural areas, smaller communities, more communities outside of the major areas, in order to heat buildings throughout the province. So that increasing that infrastructure to provide natural gas to those areas is going to go against what we need to do, which is to reduce fossil fuels as a source for heating buildings through the province. Next slide, please. So what do they need to do? They need to work in a number of directions for this. First, they need a comprehensive program to reduce emissions from existing and new buildings. They need to speed up fuel switching. So we need to get off natural gas and then propane in the rural areas, which is a lot of what's being used, and switch it to electrical heat pumps, and or when we've had a presentation on this recently, district heating and cooling systems in urban areas where they're feasible. We need to improve the energy efficiency of building envelopes. And we really have to keep in mind here that 90% of the buildings that we're going to be using in the next 20, 30 years, while we're trying to reduce emissions, are already built. So we're talking about a major retrofit programs to improve those building envelopes, their roofs, their wall and basement insulation, apply external insulation finishing systems. I'm not sure if people are really familiar with this, but where you put tack insulation right onto the side of the buildings, and we did this in a small condo that I was part of several years ago, and it made a huge difference our energy use. Air sealing is a big thing. It's actually very inexpensive to do, but it requires some practice and some skill. And we should be seeing a lot of that, particularly on poorly developed public housing and old apartment buildings around in our urban environments. And then finally, we need to look at expanding the use of renewable energy in buildings, including solar on top of the buildings to replace some of the electrical energy that's now coming from elsewhere and could take some pressure off of the grid. And geothermal energy. We see that actually more and more geothermal energy is being used in new condominium buildings, but they could ratchet that up quite a bit more, and it could be used more in rural areas in particular. Next slide. I can't really speak to the kind of social policies that need to get into place, but one of the things that needs to be kept in mind when we start to do these new programs is avoiding energy insecurity for low-income housing. This is really difficult because if your energy systems, if you're switching energy systems, you're putting a whole lot of money into new, like what is that I'm looking for? Heat pumps, for example. The installation of those heat pumps is not cheap. And if we're looking at low-income households who are often in the poorest insulated buildings, the least energy efficient buildings and so on, asking them to put a whole lot of money into this is ridiculous, and they're going to have higher energy bills and so on. So thinking about this program has to take into consideration those things. Also, the kind of renovictions that occur and the overwhelming stress that could be on the electricity grid. We're going to be asking a lot of the electricity grid. And so how to build that grid, strengthen it, increase the sources of generation sources that don't rely on fossil fuels is going to be a major requirement in order to put in the building programs that we need. Can I have the next slide, please? So most of these programs, when you're thinking about government policies, you're usually thinking about a combination of voluntary actions and mandatory actions. And we haven't talked much about the voluntary side so far in this presentation, but part of the voluntary side requires education. We see HVAC companies still who have the capacity to put in heat pumps, for example, not telling people who need a new furnace or are just looking to do a renovation on their home that heat pumps are a good source, an alternate source of heat, both for heating water and for space heating. So we need to really work on them to make sure that they're offering those services. And we need to educate building owners about this possibility. I know of several people in the last year or two who've had new furnaces installed, good thinking, supporting climate change action people who had no idea about heat pumps as an alternative. So education is a big thing that has to go on. Secondly, we need to require the owners, particularly of commercial, institutional, and multi-residential buildings, to track and report their energy use. Now, this is a bit of a mandatory action, but the idea behind this is if they're tracking their energy use and having to report it, they're going to be thinking more about what they have to do to reduce the cost of that energy and reduce the use of that energy. So it's a mandatory program to encourage voluntary action. We also need to do it at the level of single-family homes, implement a home energy rating and disclosure system that is used in real estate sales. So if anybody who's getting their home ready for selling has to disclose their home energy use as part of the package of material that goes to potential buyers, that is going to encourage people to start, who can maybe afford to do on a voluntary basis, improve insulation in their homes, improve their energy efficiency, and so on. The UK has this I just rented a building in the UK about 11 or 12 years ago for a few months. And I had got an energy rating for the house. It was an A, B, C, D, E, F. I got a C on the house. I'd hoped for better, but it definitely influences your thinking. Another thing that encourages voluntary actions, of course, are grants, interest-free loans, subsidies to accelerate building retrofits. We're seeing this in the city of Toronto, and we've seen it elsewhere. These things work. They may be, if you're getting an interest-free loans, it's still a loan. Ultimately, the owner of the building is still responsible for it. But if we're reducing energy use of high-income buildings, we're still reducing energy use. I agree that programs really need to be put in place for lower-income communities as well. But it's like the electric vehicles. If it's mostly middle class and higher people who are buying electrical vehicles, it's still taking emissions off the road. So we shouldn't poo-poo it just because it's more high-income people that might take it up. I can't see my last point because somebody's got a chat thing up on the screen at the moment. Okay, we have to provide incentives for rooftop solar installations, I think. Next slide, please. For mandatory measures, there's a whole array of measures that need to go into place. One of the primary ones is to update the Ontario Building Code to a net zero standard. The Ontario building codes are always 7 or 8 years behind what's going on at the national level. At the national level, building codes are proposed new building codes, and they go out to the provinces that take their time to decide which of the national building code recommendations they're going to do. And Ontario is way behind in this. So we need to ratchet it up and go beyond the national building code where necessary. And there's at the federal level, there is in process plans for a new retrofit code, which would be important to put into place as well, so that contractors that are doing retrofits are required to retrofit up to a certain level in terms of energy efficiency. I think we should also be looking at implementing a ban on the new installation of gas-fired furnaces, boilers, and appliances in the near term. I'd like to see this by 2025. It would be a challenge, but a challenge we need to rise to. And I've already mentioned the retrofit code. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide here. Another really, really, really important aspect of this is to increase the capacity in the building sector to actually do the kind of work we're talking about. So we need a large-scale job training program that will ensure that we have skilled trades able to implement large-scale retrofits in net zero building construction. One of the ways to do this is to subsidize or provide free tuition for green careers or careers in green building at Ontario community colleges, training centers, apprenticeship programs, and so on. That could make a huge difference to the influx of people into that environment. And finally, and not least, to support social enterprise that train youth and marginalized community members to undertake retrofits, particularly in low-income communities. We've seen a little bit of that, for example, in the Regent Park redevelopment, for example, where they've taken some of people, the community members from Regent Park who want to be trained in these skills, taken them on as part of the retrofit program. There's been some wonderful social enterprises across Canada at different points with Indigenous people, for example, training Indigenous youth in these kinds of skills to then go into their communities where people can get subsidies or grants to retrofit substandard housing and to involve those community members in doing it at the same time.
I'm going to talk about Ontario's electricity system, which is really a tangle of public, private, and semi-private companies. And roughly speaking, when you think about the electricity system, you're talking about 3 major components: the generators that supply the power, the transmission system that carries the power from the generating stations to the load centers, and the distribution system that feeds the power to nearby homes and industries. This system has a lot of challenges, and they're shown on the next slide. You can see the massive players in the whole system. I wonder how many of you remember, I'm sure you do, the huge power outage that we had in 2003 when more than 50 million people in Ontario and the northeastern United States experienced one of the largest power outages in history in North America. I do, because I was sitting on my outside porch actually writing a report about the Pickering nuclear station at the time. And when the electricity goes out, you just know how fundamental it is to our economic well-being, our social welfare, and our health. This system now has a lot of challenges, and basically it's to transform and to accommodate the demands that my colleagues talked about before, to electrify everything in a net zero economy. And it's also a system that's been undergoing major transformations for the last couple of decades. Ontario's system went through a huge restructuring period following years of planning and consultation. And in May 2002, we opened it up to retail and wholesale electricity markets. That summer, the weather was so hot and retail prices reached, I remember, levels that consumers had never encountered. And 7 months later, the provincial government basically froze all the prices. So we're going through another period, having just really in many ways not settled the system down at all, to where we're going to need to make further foundational changes. We're going to have to double our clean electricity to meet the demands coming from the transportation industry and building sector. The electricity grid has to be smarter and more resilient, and we're going to need access to new forms of financing, but most importantly, we're going to need a conversation. I put the slide in because I think it shows you the installed generation capacity in Ontario, but it shows you overall how important each of the sources are. Nuclear, which is shown here at 34% capacity, actually runs 60% of the time. The hydroelectric runs about 26% of the time, 7% from wind, and 2% from solar. And the remainder is primarily from natural gas with some biomass. But you can see natural gas could run, in fact, significantly more, because we have capacity of about 20%, 28% of the whole system. But nuclear, as I said, runs 60% of the time. So it gives you an idea just of what we have installed and what we could run and some of the challenges that come out of that. The next slide shows you the context. I want to talk a bit about the context and what we're facing. The current government has really undermined earlier progress in GHG emissions reduction. We have an electricity system which I think is pretty messy at the moment. We've put ourselves, the province, on a path to increasing greenhouse gas emissions significantly by 2030. Right now, gas is run primarily for peaking, but the concern is that as we move forward and as demands increase, we're going to have it running more for just capacity, using its unused capacity more significantly. The government canceled a lot of the renewable contracts, which were, albeit at a very high cost, when they first took power. And the cost to that was another $231 million to the whole system. So right now, we really have lost a lot of the renewable contracts that we had in place. I think most importantly, and you've heard this from Jennifer and others, they disabled the energy efficiency programs, which are we need to play a really critical role. And I think one of the biggest failures is that we don't have a conversation yet on the transformation and what options there are available to kind of meet the needs of, as we go forward, to double or triple even the amount of electricity that we're going to need. This other last point points to what has happened, and it's not just the Tories. The Liberals started, and all governments are, I think, responsible for this, really significant subsidization of our electricity rates, with the Liberals first with something called the fair hydro rates, where they took off 25% of your bill. The Tories moved on steroids on this, and what you see is that and these numbers are from the Ontario Financial Accountability Office just in February, that further subsidized rates from general revenues have going to cost taxpayers $118 billion over the next 20-year period. That's quite a chunk of money that we are paying for from general revenues. So what do we need to do? I think we can get back on track, but I think it's going to be really important to undertake a really full public review and start a conversation on what our electricity options are. We're going to have to limit the use somehow of gas plants and really find a time to phase them out. We need to increase the supply of renewables, and obviously open some discussions with Hydro-Quebec. Hydro-Quebec is a really interesting option, not only for supply, but also for storage capacity as you move towards renewables. Ontario's hydroelectric plants tend to be run of the river, whereas hydro has large capacity in their reservoirs to act potentially and help out on times when we need to peak power, when we have peak power, basically. Certainly reinstating energy efficiency programs. And probably one of the most complicated challenges is going to be to transform our electricity grid to make it smarter, more resilient through new technologies, equipment, controls that communicate with one another, so that when people have EVs, and they're not driving them, they can hook them back up and sell power back into the system. So it's a two-way conversation that we're going to need, as opposed to power flowing from the large plants right through the system. And people can in fact become generating centers themselves, whether it's solar plants, EVs, or other forms of generation. And the last thing I think is really important, and that's what I showed you on the page before, is the amount of subsidization that we have in this system. We've got to think about how we use those subsidies and think about targeting support for low-income consumers, as well as targeting an economic transformation so that we're better placed as we go forward.
Yeah, and it was about the installed capacity. And I didn't understand what you were saying. Like, were you saying that we're not using all of the hydro, nuclear, even gas capacity that we have?
Let me just, I should have done a definition, but I thought it got a little too wonky. Energy, there are two ways you can look at it. Electricity is measured both in capacity and energy. In other words, watts and watt hours. And you need to understand the difference in order to really understand how the power grid works. What you see on the chart that I've shown you is capacity. That's how much we have. But in fact, we run it at different amounts. It's the energy is the amount of electricity a generator produces over a period of time. So while you see the electricity capacity for nuclear is much smaller, we actually can run our nukes 60% of the time.
Okay, so you're saying, could we run these systems more and generate more power? That's my question.
We are, in fact, the capacity of, we are running our nuclear 60% of the time. We are running our hydroelectric 26% of the time. And gas, which is really interesting, right? We aren't running as much as we could. And that's that I think what the Tories are potentially going to do by not building enough and bringing in renewables is that they have that capacity with the gas, which is why the concern is about emissions going up so high. Because we have a lot of gas capacity now with the 4 plants, and we could run it much further. They're doing it though, because as the nuclear plants go down, they can't leave the province, or don't want to leave the province without any supply. And I think that's what's happening.
I think we have to begin to think of the timing of electricity. We have a lot of electricity in this province. The problem is no one wants to use it during the night. And so it's like a subway, we don't have enough when it's peak periods, but we have far enough. And so the issue becomes storage. And as we all know with renewables, unless we can store that energy better, and I'd like you to comment on that, we actually are not going to move forward as well as we would like to. The next observation is, and we've talked about this before in terms of nuclear, you just have to look at what Germany did. in closing virtually all of its nuclear plants. And it is now in such a disaster area that they have to have Russian gas and Russian oil. So because they close down their plants faster than the capacity for renewable energy. So there is a balance that takes time to get to that. So can you comment on those two issues?
Thanks, Rick. Well, on capacity, you're absolutely right. And the storage rather side of it. In order to deal with the, and to expand our renewables, we need to have ways basically to deal with the fact that they're intermittent. And it can't just be with gas plants, which is how we deal with the intermittency in our system now. Quebec is potentially a really good option because they have that storage capacity. And I think also, there are other ways to do it. Batteries are improving a lot over time. There are even ways that I've heard about, which maybe this gets a little obscure, but you can use it, some nuclear plants sometimes with some peaking capacity. And that's, as Rick said, we use a lot of energy during the day, and then at night, we're not using as much, which is why we've got time of use pricing in Ontario, which is a very important aspect and technique that we use. On your other point about nuclear, I think people saw what happened in Germany, and they're trying to move now as quickly as they can to get off some of the their gas from Russia, and it's going to be a real big challenge for them. We'll see how they do. Nuclear in most of what I've read plays some role. It's a very big role in Ontario for sure. If we were to try to change and move over to renewables, it would be pretty challenging. It's an expensive undertaking, as we see from the prices on nuclear. So, but it's a big part of our overall electricity system.
No, I just want to bring it quickly back to the election because in Karen's slides, it became very clear that we have lost 4 years of the ability to create alternative energy sources other than fossil fuels under this government. And that is I just want to sort of bring that back so people realize that the government in power has a lot to do with what the solutions are. So I think we're trying to give you an idea of what some of those possibilities are, but it's government that is going to make the difference here, and why this election is so important, because if we lose another 4 years with no renewable growth, and let's also be reminded that renewable energy, the cost of renewable energy is significantly cheaper than nuclear energy or any other source of energy. So there's an economic factor in there as well for the long term.
So adaptation, it isn't about emissions reduction, although actually there are some strategies that combine emissions reduction and adaptation at the same time, but I won't get into that in any detail. But really, we're still on a trajectory of increasing emissions at the moment, and stronger storms, more winds, more floods, more wildfires, and so on and we need to start protecting ourselves better against this. Could I have the next slide, please? So the challenge we saw in BC this year, last year, it was stunning, where they had a huge heat wave and drought, followed by wildfires, in part induced by the heat wave, and then huge thunderstorms, ice storms, and floods, high winds, and sorry, I'm mixing up my things. So we saw in BC that climate breakdown is occurring, and we're also seeing in Ontario heat waves and droughts, thunderstorms, ice storms, and floods, high winds and tornadoes, and power blackouts. They haven't in Ontario in recent years been as spectacular as they were in BC. That doesn't mean we're immune to this. So what does it do? It puts at risk our lives and our health. Where a tornado comes through, in flooding, people's houses get black mold. it affects our built environment, both our critical infrastructure, bridges, roads, electrical transmission systems. It definitely affects our agriculture, and there hasn't been enough attention paid to how it affects our agriculture and how we begin to recover from that. And of course, our natural environment. We see tornadoes taking swaths of trees down, and the floods affecting shorelines and so on. Could I have the next slide, please? So what's the context that we're doing this in? Well, the current Tory government does not acknowledge really climate change, and it definitely doesn't plan for climate change impacts. In fact, they've done the reverse. In 2018, among the things that they did was to simply end a whole lot of provincial adaptation programs that had been put in place by the previous government. Their codes and standards, for which we don't think about very much, are both the Ontario Building Code that I talked about earlier, flood control standards, sewers, how sewers are built and what kind of water pressure they have to undertake, particularly, or stormwater systems in particular, roads and bridges. They're not looking at even today's climate data, much less what's going to come out 10 or 15 or 20 or 40 years in the future. When you build a new stormwater system, you want it to last 80 or 100 years because it's really expensive. It disrupts everything. And if your standards aren't taking into account what the weather is going to be, then you're going to be fixing those systems a lot sooner. And in the meantime, there's going to be damage done. They reduced funds for and weakened conservation authorities, and we've seen a lot about this recently. The mandate of the conservation authorities that was set up all through southern Ontario in the early 1950s was to protect us from flooding as a result of the hurricane that went through, Hurricane Hazel, and did so much damage then. And floods are currently the most hazardous and most expensive impact that we see in Ontario from climate change. So we really need to be thinking about this and strengthening the institutions that can help protect us. Next slide, please. So what are some of the things we need to do, or we want the Ontario government to do in its next round? First of all, they should be releasing this 2021 climate change impact assessment, which they bragged about when they set up this advisory panel on climate change in 2019 to report in 2021 on what the government calls this, and it was a lie, the first ever climate impact assessment to be done for Ontario. Several of these had been done previously. And then when this panel, which included a lot of good adaptation experts, when they reported in November 2021, the government hid the report. It's now 5 months later, and it has not been released. I've been trying to get it released. MPs have been trying to get it released. We've sent freedom of information requests to get this released. The Auditor General complained that it wasn't released and she could not get a copy of it. So they're hiding something there, and I'd like to see what it is. The next thing they have to do is to activate a comprehensive climate adaptation strategy. One was underway under the previous government. It wasn't good enough, but it was a start and lots of things were being done, and they just ended that. So we need to make sure that happens, and it needs to take into consideration all the things we've talked about: floods, wildfires, heat, as a huge health problem, and so on. We need to fund the rapid development and distribution of tools, including things like flood maps. So there's flood maps in some parts of the province, for example, that are updated, but very few that look ahead 20 years. So given the changes that are going on, given the increase in precipitation during thunderstorms and so on, and the increase in flooding from ice breaking up really, really quickly in rivers and lakes and so on. We need not only flood maps that look at current flood situations, which we don't exist in some parts of the province, but what's likely to happen in 20 or 30 years. What buildings are in those flood zones? What critical infrastructure is in those flood zones. What do we have to move and what do we have to strengthen in order to not be spending a huge amount of money on rebuilding every time we get a flood through here? And we need to expand the funding and decision-making authority of the conservation authorities instead of going in the previous direction, which the last two BC governments have done. These are really good organizations, and they do help to protect us against flooding, the major impact in Ontario so far. Next slide, please. So what else? I emphasize the importance of climate change data, and we really need to see it being incorporated into environmental assessments, infrastructure vulnerability assessments, highway and bridge design codes. There's been actually a new highway and bridge design code recommended at the federal level that, if it was implemented in Ontario, would mean more than 200 bridges each year would be assessed and would probably have to be reinforced in order to withstand some of the kinds of floods that we're anticipating. Stormwater management regulations, Ontario Building Code we've talked about, and the Ontario Planning Act and land use planning. Next. And so last but certainly not least, we really need to protect and restore natural features. We have our forests, our wetlands and peatlands, the peatlands in the north, for example, our shorelines, our urban green spaces and trees all help to protect us. They protect us from flooding. They protect us from air pollution. They protect us from extreme heat, which is going to be particularly important in the urban settings. So we really, rather than tearing down some of these to put in new highways or running bulldozers through peatlands to extract minerals and so on, we really need to have a comprehensive strategy to protect these things which protect us. So the summary of what we've been doing leads us to these conclusions. First of all, climate change must become a key focus of the next Ontario government. Secondly, we need to, as members of CAL and with our friends and acquaintances who are in on this thing today, we need to make climate change an issue in this election. So we need to be sharing these materials with friends and neighbors. This report that we've done, which is quite concise and includes most of the information that we've spoken about in today's presentations. We can share these with friends and neighbors and family, but also we should be talking to individual candidates in the elections, going to all candidates meetings and bringing up questions that arise from some of the information that we've provided, the kitchen table discussions that are beginning to happen around the election and so on. And wherever we can, we need to be raising these issues, raising people's awareness of it and their concerns. And we hope that these materials are useful for all of you in your commitment to doing this.
So the call has been involved in a couple coalitions of people who are concerned about what will happen after June 2nd in the Ontario election. One of them is Seniors Ontario Election Team. It's about 14 groups across Ontario who have sort of a common goal to ensure that the PCs don't get a majority, because our feeling is, even though most of the groups in this 14 consider themselves nonpartisan, what we do know after the last 4 years is that if the PCs get another majority, we will see no progress on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario. Zero. Nothing will happen. And therefore, getting a minority government in place, which it's clear from what Liz has expressed so far, unless some dramatic thing happens in the next 80 days or 78 days or however many are left, we're going to have a PC government of some kind. So having a minority would help, because they will be forced to compromise on some things. And so that group is also producing a whole bunch of resources for community use. There's a larger campaign, which is what I'm going to talk about in the next slide, but the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign, and we will give you a link in the chat for this, is to empower citizens to ask the hard questions of politicians. And that is their whole strategy. And they have a 12-point plan of 12 things that they're trying to push all of us, and including a lot of things we've talked about today, but they go a little further into social policy and other issues beyond climate change. It's mostly around climate change. So the action of the day is to go to the link, again, that will be in the chat, to the Ontario Climate Emergency.ca. This is where you'll be able to sign a pledge as an individual, and the pledge is what's on the screen, to committing to use your voice, to engage in democratic choices. And it may include things like letters and petitions, or any, a whole range of things will appear on this website, the Ontario Climate Emergency website. And CAL has decided that this is really where we will stream our supporters to this group, because it's well organized. It's a coalition of things like environmental defense and the physicians for the environment. A whole number of organizations in Ontario are members of this, and it's being supported by the David Suzuki Foundation. So there's resources, money, and there's a staff person that they're loaning to us for the period of the election. So the action is to go to this website, sign the climate pledge, and when you do that, you will be signed up to get notices about what is going on in relation to the election, where you can decide to contribute your energy or time to one of those activities if it's at all possible. The overall hope is that people will get engaged in ridings where the Conservatives are not guaranteed to win. In other words, the hope is to get a Liberal, NDP, Green, doesn't really matter, any other party except the Blue Party, to take one of those seats, because all of those parties, the NDP, the Liberals, and the Green Party, have climate plans. And that really is the problem with the PCs. They do not have a climate strategy. So any members that we can get elected from those three parties will put pressure on the PC, hopefully minority government, or even majority government, to do something more dramatic around climate change. So that's the action of the day.
It's a comment, actually, because I'm so incensed by sort of a dinosaur approach to climate by the current government, and the regression that we've seen over the last almost 4 years now. When I got my driver's license fee rebate, felt like blood money, definitely a bribe. So I made I contributed it to another party, and I don't normally make political contributions, but I contributed to another party with a strong green platform, knowing full well that I'd get 75% of that back as a tax credit. And then I'm flipping that plus a little bit more to a not-for-profit that rescues food and feeds people and teaches them how to cook. So it's an individual action. I've shared my individual action with people in my social circle in hopes that they might be inspired. So I'd like to turn this individual action into a collective action as a protest against this license fee rebate, which really only serves those of us who are privileged enough to be able to afford a car.
And can we just add to that? Let your MPP know you've done this.
Good idea.
I also actually told the party in the comments section what I had done. So the party receiving the funds was aware they were getting these funds and what they were coming from.
Let your MPP know, because you are, they need to hear that people are not happy. This works out to 33 cents a day that this is giving back. And to me, my vote is worth a whole lot more than $120. And I just feel that if they're really concerned about what people are doing on, if they're really concerned about how people are living and needing rebates, then they shouldn't have shouldn't have canceled the increase in the minimum wage. They should have looked to give mandatory time off when people were sick with COVID. They shouldn't have stopped and others of you will know the correct name of the income support program that they were doing as a pilot. There were so many things that if you really care about people who are having trouble making ends meet because their income is so low and their housing costs and costs of living are so high, there's so many things that could have been done and done far more effectively than this. So anyway, very angry about it.
So I'm very depressed about the forthcoming election. It seems that, and I live in an area where it's been conservative for, God, I can't even remember when. I would love to volunteer for one of the other parties, but I think it's going to be a waste of energy because there's just no way, given the statistics that were presented, and it just maddens me that when this government gets in, they're going to push forward with the highway, 413 highway, and just destroy many areas of green and farmland. So I don't know. I mean, the only thing that I'm thinking positive is that because I've lost a little bit of my balance, I used to ride a lot on my bike, but I'm considering getting a 3-wheel bicycle for the summer, just so that I can use less. We reduced our number of vehicles in our house from 2 to 1, and I'm waiting till I can get an electric car, which may not be for some time. But it's just frustrating to see, as you mentioned, all the things that this government has done to just increase the climate crisis. So I need to hear some positive stuff from everyone.
The problem is that all these little bribes that the PCs are giving are working. You know, they're very cynical and they know exactly what works. And I'm wondering if maybe Michael Barclay, could you talk about what the climate emergency campaign is doing to make it clear to people who are voting, who are, you know, who believe that the PCs are working for them, to show them what's really happening, because I think it's sort of a lack of awareness. And I know that other groups like ours are knocking on doors and things like that, but I really think there's got to be some kind of a mass media campaign.
I can talk a little bit about what the coalition is trying to do. They're working with GreenPAC to identify about 14 ridings where the PCs are in danger of losing their seat. It's around 14. Jennifer mentioned earlier about spending some time in one of those 14 ridings trying to help out whatever party, whether it's the NDP or the Liberals or the Greens, it doesn't really matter, in order to try to ensure that a Conservative does not gain a seat in one of those 14 ridings. I think the problem for a lot of us who live in urban ridings is that they generally are not Conservative ridings. They're either Liberal or NDP. And they're probably going to retain their status, hopefully, in wherever you live. But if you're living in an area, one of those 14 ridings, some of them are Scarborough, Etobicoke, Milton. There are areas around us where you could go and volunteer. So the strategy of the coalition is to identify those 14, support somebody who might unseat a conservative, and to make sure they don't get a majority. That's really the only objective of this group. Now, there's more to it than that, because they're also producing resources. They're producing letters to the editor. They're producing giving links to other organizations in those 14 ridings that are trying to do some work, so you can connect with them and provide some assistance or labor or support in whatever way you can. So it kind of addresses a bit what Henry's concern is. There is a strategy to try to make sure they don't get a majority. That's about the only hope, based on what Liz has pointed out, that we can hope for. In terms of mass media, I think that's, it's a good point, but there is no money in the not-for-profit sector for mass media. Instead, what the group is doing is using social media. And even that is very expensive. If you want to position a post that you put onto Facebook or Twitter or anything else, you need to pay those companies to get your message up front to people. So that's also very expensive. Even the political parties are finding it getting more and more costly to use social media as well. But that's about all these groups can do, because they don't have money. The not-for-profit organizations are not funded by anybody. They're just membership driven and volunteer donations, if anything. I think this coalition will probably have a couple $1,000, and so will the Seniors Coalition. It might have $3,000 or $4,000. That's it. So you're not exactly buying advertising with that kind of money.
Okay, two things. One is, have they considered a GoFundMe campaign? And my other question is, I spoke to a woman who's running, Mary Margaret McMahon, who's running for the Liberals in Beaches, East York. I spoke to her yesterday. And she says that, I asked her, where is Stephen Del Duca? I thought he was maybe in the witness protection program, because you don't see him. And I'm wondering, and she says, well, she just can't get, or they can't get the media to focus on him. But surely they can get some advice from media companies or advertising companies who are sympathetic to the climate cause, to give them a hand on how to get some attention. Are they doing that? Okay, but even the climate emergency campaign.
They are having a press conference where the Ontario Nurses Association has given their media list and their media room in order to have an opening press conference in a week or two. I can't remember when, but again, if you sign up on that website, you're going to hear about it, in order to launch this campaign. So we'll see whether anybody picks up on that, whether the media shows up. There's a hope that it will, because of the sponsors, like the Nurses Association. I mean, they do have some clout, when they speak, they're listened to. And so the list of supporters and endorsers, when you go on the website to sign your individual pledge, you'll see how many organizations are behind it. And they are going to be amplifying the message of this coalition. Every time the coalition does some kind of strategic move, all of the endorsers will let their members know. So that's one way that they're communicating to the broader audience.
About the Liberals, I did see that they are still nominating candidates. I saw in the Toronto Star, and some high-profile candidates. So I think it's a bit too soon to write them off. In my riding, Toronto Centre, where Michael is, we've just learned that the NDP candidate is not, MPP is not going to run again. And I've been involved in setting up a meeting with the Liberal candidate, David Morris, to talk about ranked ballots. but it would seem that it would be equally possible to set up a meeting with him to talk about climate. I may be speaking way out of turn because I don't know what you've actually said, but it just seems to me that we should be looking for good Liberal candidates as they come forward. There's the one in Etobicoke Lakeshore, who's the head of some big health organization, who's just signed up for the Liberal.
In the interest of full disclosure, I am the Green Party candidate in Toronto, St. Paul. So I just want you to know that, and this is not a political pitch, because I know you're nonpartisan. I want to say a few things. First of all, this is an excellent presentation, an excellent session. I intend to attend more of them. So, but I want to address Henry's comments about being depressed. First of all, don't put any stock in the polling. Polls these days are consistently wrong. Their methodology is not kept up with the times, and they're not reaching people who they need to reach. So don't take a lot of don't put a lot of credibility in those numbers, as depressing as they seem. Number two, the whole idea about strategic voting doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because it doesn't send a clear message. The message that I'm hearing on this call, and the reason I'm running, is because the climate crisis is the number one priority, period. And if you don't vote that way, if it becomes strategic versus a bold statement, then whoever forms the government doesn't get the message. They don't get the message. Like, if you vote for a party that has a multitude of planks and they're not really anywhere, their position on climate is sort of watered down, there's no clear message there. So that's my recommendation. Whoever you're going to vote for, pick the one who has the loudest voice for the climate. Use your voice. I don't, the whole strategic thing, don't do that. Don't do it. I mean, here's where I'll end on. Here's my vision. That Ford will form the government. It'll be a minority government, short of about 5 or 6 seats. That's my vision. That's the story I'm kind of painting as I talk to people. Not like I want that to happen, but that's better than a majority. It's likely. And imagine what that would mean if whoever holds the balance of power is a party that is unwilling to compromise on doing what it takes to prevent catastrophic climate change. Unwilling. And whoever is holding government is forced to be pulled in that direction. That's my vision.
Thank you very much to the group for doing all this work. An incredible amount of time and great material. I have to support, I feel the same way as Henry does, based on what we heard to start off with, notwithstanding what Ian just said. Long term, I think we have to continue with the idea of recruiting as many people as we can and training them and mobilizing in some fashion. And so I thank Michael for his suggestion on the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign. I can't remember who it was who talked about the 2021 climate change impact assessment. Has the press been gone to over that? Is it worthwhile going to the press to get that report released? Because it must be hidden for some reason and might be detrimental to those in power if it were.
I can speak to that, David. The only press I've gone to is the National Observer. They actually got an earlier report. I actually don't even remember what it was, but they got an earlier report released a few months ago that the Tories had actually been sitting on as well. And so when I submitted my own Freedom of Information request, I suggested to them that they do it. But I think it doesn't hurt to go to the Star or to the CBC and say, you should be asking for this. I know multiple requests have gone in, but it seems to me if it's the press, they're more likely to get some action on it. Whether they'll do that before the election, I don't know.
Thank you, Jennifer. Do we have Michael and group a way of mobilizing to do that?
Well, I think we could certainly take that to our upcoming leadership team meeting and decide whether, as an organization, we could also make a request. But I think the request should go to this coalition, to the election coalition. So I will take that on for sure.
But I wanted to say that it is really that you can make a Freedom of Information request online, and it's very, very simple. It only took me about 5 or 10 minutes to do it.
So
as long as you have the name of the report.
We're going to send out an email with all the links and so on after this meeting to everybody. We could include the name of the report, the link for it could be another action that we could take, not just joining the coalition and signing the pledge, but also to make a Freedom of Information request. If they get hundreds of them, maybe that will help as well.
I should also say it's a $5 fee.
Yeah, we can use some of our rebate money to pay for it.
Right. Good point, Henry.
Exactly.
Because right now, to be honest, it doesn't look too good, and we need something dramatic in addition.
I have a comment on that. I can't quote figures and numbers and so on, but I think climate change is affecting agricultural production, and it's affecting health. And if we've got a lot of people getting COVID who are working in the fields and getting sick and not able to gather the poor crops that are the result of droughts and floods and so on, I bet there is a way of proving a connection between at least food inflation with climate change.
Here's the connection in my mind. So inflation is the function of a few things, but we know it's connected definitely to the pandemic that initiated it, right? The pandemic is clearly connected to climate change. As we're putting more and more pressure on ecosystems, we're coming in contact with wildlife that we shouldn't be in, zoonotic exchange of disease and migration and whatnot. So that's a clear connection to inflation, but and then the supply chain disruptions as a result of all that. But the thing I'm going to say, which might not be that politically popular, but I'm going to say it anyway, because someone referenced it in one of the presentations today. We have to reduce our consumption. We have to change our lifestyle to do more with less. And inflation is going to cause that. It's going to force us to consume less, and that gives us hope if we're going to have a chance at beating the 1.5 degree Celsius threshold. It doesn't help people who are just barely getting by, who can't afford to buy their food as the prices go up. It doesn't help them, but that's where government has to come in and give those people a hand up. But so when people ask about inflation, I don't know if it's a bad thing, if it's going to help us alter our behavior, because I don't know what is. I don't know what is going to do it if it's not going to be price mechanisms.
This is inflation caused by changes, short-term changes right now. But if we look at what can be the impact if we don't deal and adapt to climate change, and if we don't take steps to reduce the extent of climate change, this inflation is minimal. It's negligible to what the impact will be on costs, on our lives, on everything, when major areas of the world are not producing food at the levels they were, when the oceans are not producing food at the levels they were. These are things, this inflation is nothing compared to what we need to avoid. The trouble is risk avoidance, as I know from 20 years of battling with senior managers, is really hard to price. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to avoid certain risks in the future.
So I think that one of the issues that we're going to have a hard time with is the fact that many people who are on the conservative side or lean that way are going to look at what's happening at the federal level with the liberals and spending and especially with the agreement that's been made between the NDP and the Liberals, and say, well, you know, they're interested in is spending more of my money, and look at what's happening. I am paying more for gas, and I'm paying more for food, and what have you. And so, you know, most people are extremely short-sighted, and that's what they're going to focus on, just what immediately affects them. So it's going to be a hard hill to climb to justify, you know, saying, okay, well, yeah, that's true, but the climate is very important and we've got to deal with that. So it's going to be a tough issue. I agree that maybe the polls are not as accurate, and we still got 2 months to go, but it's going to be a tough slog to convince people when they're looking at what's happening to their pocketbook.